I'd like to introduce our chair for today, Professor Zoe Radnor, Vice President, Strategy and Planning, Diversity and Inclusion at City University, London.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeannette. We still have a few colleagues that are still joining us for these presentations. So as we're waiting for others to join us, and thank you very much for those powerful words to start with, I'm going to introduce each of the panel members. As Jeannette has said, my name is Zoe Radnor. I am Vice President, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Strategy and Planning, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at City University of London. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about some of the work that I and my colleagues have been doing. But before I do so, I just want to introduce each of the panel members and allow them to introduce themselves briefly before we start on the presentations. So I'm first going to turn to Hilary, and I'll ask Hilary to turn on her camera and introduce herself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me speak at this webinar. I think it's incredibly important that we're having these action-focused conversations right now. I am the Vice President Higher Education at the National Union of Students, and my background is that I've just finished as the Undergraduate Education Officer at Bristol Students' Union, where I did a lot of work on decolonization, race equity, and making sure that we are, embedding anti-racism practice in all aspects of education. So I'm really pleased to be here, and I look forward to speaking to you all very soon.
Thank you very much. And Zainab.
Thanks, Zoe. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zainab Khan. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Outcomes and Inclusion at London Metropolitan University, and I oversee the learning and teaching strategy as it relates to driving fair outcomes for our students, and also ensuring that we progress real change around EDI for our staff. Really looking forward to the conversation this afternoon.
Thank you very much. And Kevin.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Coutinho, and in my day job, I'm the Athena Swan manager at UCL, but I'm also co-chair of the Higher Education Race Action Group, and I'm chair of a race equality charity called the Windsor Fellowship, which provides training and development opportunities for students from Black and Asian communities. I'm very excited that we now have a focus on race equality, and I hope that this session will help colleagues to understand or consider ways in which we can progress this.
Thank you very much indeed. And to Sarah.
Hi, thanks, Zoe. My name is Sarah Sharples. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion and People at the University of Nottingham. I've been in that role for just over 2 years now, and really looking forward to taking part in the panel. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much indeed. And Udi.
My name is Udi Archibong. I'm really pleased to be involved in this. I am a Professor of Diversity. I direct the Center for Inclusion and Diversity, and I provide strategic oversight for equality, diversity and inclusion at the University of Bradford. I've been there, I'm still here, and I've loved the work that I do around EDI. These are challenging times, and I'm very pleased that we're having this conversation.
Brilliant, thank you. And as you can see, it's an outstanding, myself excluded, but it's an outstanding set of panelists we have for you today. We've just been informed that some colleagues are finding it difficult to join the panel at the moment due to links, but I think we're going to proceed as planned, because I'm aware we have over 50 attendees with us, and we can't thank you enough for the time. We appreciate how incredibly busy everyone is at the moment in higher education, with the changing winds by the, not even by the day, by the hour, in terms of what other demands upon our time are. But this is something we know is incredibly important. Tackling racism, tackling racial inequalities in higher education is a significant priority on many executive teams at the moment, including my own. And we know that it's for many of you, so we'd like to thank you for your time that you're giving up today to join us. Change is key. It is absolutely key. Words are important. Listening is critical. Understanding is fundamental. But actions, we need actions now. Action to make this change happen. We have talked about, and we will hear today, about award gaps, decolonisation, ethnic pay gaps, representation at the high levels in institutions. But for me, I'm becoming increasingly impatient about the time it's taken us to do this. I'm asked about the difference between positive action and positive discrimination, and my response is, you know, I'll start to debate the difference between those two when we have equality at the high levels and throughout organisations. Yes, it's unlawful to take positive discrimination, but I think we need to start seeing real action in what and how we are doing things in order to ensure that we start tackling racism and racial inequalities in our institutions today. We've talked about gender for a long time, and we know that we are making progress there, but we have to speed up on everything, and particularly the work around tackling racism in higher education. You'll hear today presentations about action, and that's something, when we pulled together this webinar today, we wanted to talk about action, not just talk about the issues. We wanted to talk about that action. I am the race lead for City University of London as an institutional level, and I am often asked, why is a white woman leading the race agenda at City? And my answer is if there was a different person that could do it, fantastic. But I know that I'm in that privileged position of being an executive member where I can influence the conversation, I can influence that change. And I will continue to be that ally, not that saviour. I will continue to be that ally in that executive role, using my privileged position in order to ensure, as I am at the moment, that race is discussed at every single executive meeting that I am part of at the moment. And I will use that privilege to do that. If there becomes a time where there's somebody more appropriate to lead on the race agenda at City, I will stand by, of course I will. But then I will take allyship up on LGBTQ+. I will take up allyship on the other aspects. For me, this is about equality through our institutions today. And this is not about just picking up things that are meaningful. For me, this is about true change that we need to make to happen in higher education. So you'll hear about race equality charter work. We at City as well have really pushed and working very much closer now with our staff affinity group, the Network for Racial Justice. But what I've also ensured is that we have an executive action plan. We have an action plan which executive team are held accountable to for the work that we are doing around tackling racism and racial inequality at City. We've ensured that there are safe spaces for our BAME colleagues, people of colour, to talk to us about their lived experiences. We are planning and hosted a number of panel events. We're also ensuring that there is training, mandatory training, but we all know what the pros and cons of mandatory training are. But if it at least allows us to become more comfortable with being uncomfortable, then I will push every mechanism that I can in order to achieve that. We're looking into studentships, like the likes of Leicester have done around BAME and Black studentships, particularly at PhD level. And we are going to look for ways that we can implement those in an appropriate manner to the right part of society that we can focus on. So whether that's Black PhD students or BAME PhD students. We're also looking at awards as well around this agenda. But I just briefly want to talk about two areas that I'm particularly passionate about. One is setting up a white anti-racist group, and that we know universities such as Westminster have taken the lead in actually developing white anti-racist groups. And people become very uncomfortable with that notion, but I think it's really important that there is a safe space for white colleagues, particularly senior colleagues, in order to talk about the work that they're doing. And they do that in terms of talking about allyship. As I said before, allyship is critical. And also to think about how we can be really, really strong allies and use our positions of privilege in order to achieve some of the changes that need to happen. We are still yet to get going on this because there are a number of concerns, but it's something that I think is really important. And we know from good practice that it can work very, very effectively. The other area that I want to talk about is what is reciprocal mentoring. And reciprocal mentoring is different to reverse mentoring. We launched a reciprocal mentoring scheme at City around about a year ago, and we're just launched our second round of reciprocal mentoring. Reciprocal mentoring is basically, it's about understanding, a greater understanding for senior colleagues in the institution, to understand those lived experiences of the BAME staff within higher education and at City. It also allows BAME staff, in order to support their own career development and their own development around some of the complexities of senior management in higher education today. As I said at the start, many of us are dealing with many different demands on our time. And it's really important that staff understand, as a senior leader, those complexities you have to manage. So it's about making sure that there's that reciprocal mentor, both parties, senior white member of staff and a BAME member of staff, there is that reciprocal mentoring. And I'm pleased to say we've also linked up around reciprocal mentoring with London Metropolitan, and Zainab will talk about, maybe mention that as we do, but we are linking across institutions as well, because we think that's really, really important. So again, colleagues understand those lived experiences, but also the complexities of different institutions in higher education. So reciprocal mentoring, as I say, is very different. And my aim is that all white senior leaders in City University will take part in the reciprocal mentoring scheme. And I'm pleased to say all members have signed up. And what we've got to be ensure that we are actually have mentors that are the right fit for each other in order to support that. And the work that Kavita Powley, our Race Equality Charter Manager, has done around this has been phenomenal and superb. And there are links on the City website, both to the reciprocal mentoring scheme, and she's also launched a hub recently through funding through Advanced HE called Let's Talk About Race. And there'll be some spotlight videos on that hub, Let's Talk About Race at City University of London, around, there'll be some spotlights of the mentor pairings in terms of their experience. So we can send you links through about that, so you can hear about the experience of the reciprocal mentoring scheme. So we are very clear, we launched the reciprocal mentoring scheme because it's about joint understanding, joint sharing of knowledge and experience. It's not about a reverse mentoring scheme, and that was really, really critically important. So there are two actions that we are really pushing through amongst all the array of many other actions that are happening at City. But two that we think are, one that will hopefully be very, very successful, the White Anti-Racist Group, but also the reciprocal mentoring scheme, which we know has been taken up, and people have got a lot of learning and knowledge and understanding. We all need to listen to each other. We all need to understand each other, and we all need to work together in action to ensure that we tackle racism in higher education. I am now going to hand over to Hilary to talk about the student perspective. Thank you very much, Hilary.
Thank you so much, Zoe. And I think, thinking about what you've just spoken about is great to go off of that, especially, and what really grabbed my attention is thinking, firstly, and when we're thinking about that student perspective, having the hindsight to know where students have played a key role in this work and in building anti-racist practices and promoting anti-racism within their institutions and within the sector throughout history. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. And when we think about the student movement, it's historical how students have been integral in pushing for anti-racism and the dismantling of the colonial legacy in higher education. We see that with, I come from Bristol, and Bristol's a prime example. Bristol has a deep colonial legacy, and we saw over the past few months the Coulson statue get pulled down. But what you didn't see before was students campaigning for years and years and years to not only acknowledge the colonial legacy of the city and the university, but to also take action against all of the deeply embedded systemic colonial practices that were still ongoing and still having an impact on Black and BAME students within our university community. When we think about the student movement, we stood side by side with internationalist endeavors for anti-racism. We stood side by side, in the apartheid struggle in South Africa and fought to support, the anti-apartheid movement. We really have been at the forefront of pushing and making sure that these issues have been at the forefront of university minds. And as Zoe and Jeannette referenced at the start, I think, the sector has fallen short in being able to not only listen to what has been going on and what students have been flagging for years and years and years, but to act. And I think what's really important about this panel that we're having now is that, you could go and rewatch a lot of panels that I'm sure all of us have been on, where we've talked about race, we've talked about the intersections of how race and how racial inequality and perpetrates our system. But ultimately, right now, I really want to speak to you about action, and I really want to speak to you about what action would look like that students, especially, and staff will actually feel that they can trust that action is sustainable, long-term, and meaningful. So I think, coming here, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was preparing to speak here was thinking about really effective student movements that have been effective in really pushing for tangible, sustainable action. And I was lucky to, start my role in Bristol at a time when action was all starting to come into place. And what really struck me in the action was that there were 3 key areas that I felt the action was really built upon, and I felt that those areas also made it really effective. And the 3 key areas that I identified were, firstly, care, secondly, collaboration, and thirdly, dismantling. And I will go through them step by step. So firstly, when we think about care, especially for students, I think there needs to be an understanding that as a student, you feel the first-hand impact of racism, of colonial legacy, when you move away from home, or even if you do stay at home, when you move to an institution where you're told you're going to learn all of this, information that is wider than what you've known before, that will equip you for the workplace, that will equip you for really, moving out of education and going into society. And you come into university and grapple with the fact that, there's some colonial lies that are being perpetrated as truth in your lectures. You find that you go to a building and it's named after somebody that was deeply involved in colonialism and slave trade. You go and you learn about certain practices, or even you go and you seek support as simply as seeking support, and it doesn't suit what you need as you are coming into a world where you're becoming aware and almost hyper aware of who you are and where you sit in a place where ultimately colonial legacy still sits as a foundation of how our education system has been built and how racism has been perpetrated through it. And so care, I bring up as the first point, because I think all of this work is really important, but none of this work is effective if there isn't care embedded throughout all of the work we do. I can say firsthand as a Black woman that, over my whole life, but especially over the past few months, the feeling of trauma has been real. The feeling of seeing Black death, seeing Black bodies, seeing Blackness in a way that has been for longer than I've been alive, been treated as dispensable, as Black people being treated as dispensable, has been deeply, deeply traumatic for me. And I know that my fellow students, colleagues across the sector that are in the student movement have felt that trauma deeply, especially those from racialized minorities. And so I think trauma-centered care has to start, has to be the bedrock and has to be the starting point of any work we do. Otherwise, we're doing work that we feel is good, but might not be good for the people that need us most to do this work. And what I saw as a really effective action that we did at Bristol, and actually a student led on and created, was an initiative called Black People Talk, where it was a very, very much a centered community care initiative where Black people could come into a room together and speak about their experiences and feel validated in sharing the realities of how racism had affected their lives, had affected their education. And that was a space that the university resourced and paid for students to be able to have that space to speak about the key issues, so that the university could actually act on the real life experiences that students were facing in that time. Secondly, the second point I wanted to talk about was collaboration. And I think students have been more than willing to collaborate with universities for as long as they've been, fighting against racism in the movement. And we see this for a very long time with student union officers like me going to university exec meetings and laying down our agendas on the table. And I'd be surprised if any of you haven't seen a student talk about, decolonization or anti-racism or racial inequality. And I think it's really important that, when students have campaigned or called out even universities for colonial legacy, they don't do it just to name and shame. They do it because they want to see real change. And I think what's really impactful there is that I think over the past few years and decades even, I think universities have seen students speaking about race as an attack on them, if I'm being completely honest. I think universities have been so deeply rooted in the comfortability of knowing that they've acknowledged their colonial legacy and they've made commitments to it, but they haven't acted on it. And with students calling universities to be accountable, I think universities, quite frankly, have felt attacked, that students are so fired up to see real action and see real change as a response to the colonial legacy that still, is threaded and embedded within our institutions. And so collaboration is key in making sure that the awareness that students have in all of this is acknowledged and acted upon. So commitments aren't just commitments turn into action. And within that, I think the third point, which I had to bring, is dismantling. I mean, I think none of this can be done unless we tackle the issue of racism at its root. None of the patchwork things we do where we try and do report and support works unless we tackle it at the root. And I think, it's important that we can talk about this later on in the Q&A, but I think it's important that we think about that in any of the work or anything that you take forward from this panel, that, anything you do has to tackle racism at the root, or it just will not be effective. And so what I want to leave you with as I move on to Zena is that university is starting up again. Students are coming back at the time where Black History Month is starting in October. And what I really want you to know is that, the commitments you made in March are fabulous and great and ambitious, but students need to see actual fruit from those commitments as they come back from their summer breaks, and see that you've actually heeded what you've seen, what they've told you about, and actually have taken action. Or, and I think this is a really dismal truth, students will never trust universities and leadership to take action again, and really bring in the meaningful change they've been calling for way longer than 2020. Thank you so much, and I'll move on to Zena.
Thank you very much indeed. Just before we move on to Zena, I mean, very powerful and inspirational words from Hilary, but a really strong mandate. We said we were listening in March. We need to have shown how we're listening in a few weeks' time come September. I'm sure you've got some questions for panelists and you're thinking about them now. So can I just ask you, there's a Q&A button at the bottom and questions can be put into the Q&A and they can be voted on. We're going to take the questions after the break. I'm not going to take them after each speaker. And the reason for that is I want to ensure equity, that all the speakers have the same time to speak to you this afternoon. So we're going to take all the panelists' presentations first, then there'll be a short break and we'll come back to the questions after that break. So can I just ask you to put your questions in the Q&A and then we can allow each panelist to have their allotted time. Speaking of which, I shall now pass over to Zainab for the next presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe. So it's quite nice that I'm following Hilary because I'm going to be talking about two examples of institution-wide student-facing programmes that I've led in recent years. Both examples have actually been co-designed with our Black and ethnic minority students. So the first example relates to a large-scale positive action programme which I developed on the back of a pilot that I tested in 2016, and then we launched it across the institution in 2017 when at my previous institution. In terms of the mindset and where I was professionally and thinking about what led me to that, as an institution, we had started to consider applying for the Race Equality Charter mark. And at the time there were some institutional issues with that and I felt compelled to act and do something. In addition to that, it was very much developed on the back of national labour market statistics which are published nationally. And as many colleagues here will be familiar, these statistics year on out show that despite the increasing cost of undertaking a university education, ethnic minority students are less likely to leave with graduate level employment, that they're likely to experience a race-related pay gap immediately on entry into the workplace, that they are, and actually in the case of Black graduates, they're more likely to be unemployed than employed after graduation. So the equity programme took a 4-pillar approach: coaching, mentoring, networking and enterprise skills. And it was developed by a steering group of Black and minority staff, both at the institution, also our students of colour, And then we worked with external Black and ethnic minority professionals and entrepreneurs who had lived experience of navigating the workplace, also business startups, as well as those traditional professions. And we tried to work with people who had a nuanced understanding of racism, rather than colleagues that perhaps might be more palatable and happy to toe the line. We were absolutely committed to being radical, avoiding paternalistic deficit handling of students. And I'm sure, again, many of us here are aware of the discourse in terms of where things have gone wrong in terms of interventions in the past. For us, the equity programme was all about empowerment, recognition, co-creating a community for students where they had a space to speak safely about their experiences. We also wanted to give them the same level of respect that we would expect from our own CPD activities. So if you think about any high quality programme that you might have undertaken, that's what we were trying to convey for students. That's what we were trying to provide, something that they could be proud of, that they could own. So through the coaching strands of the equity programme, we combined traditional leadership concept, where students had a chance to discuss their identity, their goal setting, but we combined it with an exploration of historical figures in Black leadership. And they also had an opportunity to critically explore the diasporic contributions in Britain around enterprise and industry. And we used activists in order to deliver the coaching. In terms of the enterprise skills, we worked with students to really think about and unpick those different forms of capital that are often spoken about when we talk about invisible forms of disadvantage, those soft skills that we know help us get on and into our careers. So the workshops included things like self-efficacy, negotiation, business pitches, how to survive racism during placement, and if not survive, then how do you report it effectively? And all of these workshops were delivered by external ethnic minority or Black professionals who, again, had that nuanced and sensitive handling of race. The networking events provided an opportunity for the whole university to come together with the external community in order to have a regular series of notable speakers such as Akala, Afua Hirsch, David Lammy. And at the time I was based at an institution in Bristol as well. And so that was quite a first for the city in order to come together and have that level of connection throughout the year, not just crammed into October's Black History Month. And perhaps later, if I have time to share during the Q&A, we can talk about the experience of implementing this positive action programme. But very briefly, the programme caused quite a stir at the time because 3 of the 4 pillars were closed only to Black and minority students, which resulted, as you can imagine, from both white staff and students, cries of reverse racism, which often came from sort of various all-white university committees. And I think understandably they were impatient perhaps to see the impact of their money. But I think there are also issues around being able to trust in a Black designed programme for Black communities, and also where minority staff are really leading the work. So in terms of how it was received, well, perhaps some of you here are familiar that we did win some notable awards, which are great, and it's never about the recognition. But if you ask the community and the students who participated, some of them would have said that equity stopped them from dropping out of the institution, and actually that's how they made all of their friends whilst they were at university. I think looking back at that experience, the piece that I'm most proud about was actually how the programme grew in the conditions that we were existing in. So it was very much an insurgency, and it was a strategic decision to focus equity around graduate outcomes, because that was, I took the decision that at the time that could be superimposed onto the institution in terms of where that university was and its readiness to deal with some of the more embedded issues around inclusive practice and decolonising. And as a result of equity, that university has since gone on then to start dealing with the bigger issues, the awarding gap and decolonising. The second example actually comes from my current institution, London Met. So I joined there last year, and as Pro-Vice Chancellor, I have the great privilege of being able to steer much of the learning and teaching strategy. So finally, I could get my hands on the awarding gap. We have an above average awarding gap of 20%, and 70% of our students are from Black or minority backgrounds. So it's an absolute institutional priority. This year, we're piloting our Education for Social Justice framework. And that, again, has been developed in partnership with the SU, with our students. We led a series of ideation sessions to really get our community thinking about our collective identity, our values, and then how we might be able to develop a new pedagogy in order to interpret and deliver that mission. I think, in fairness, the conditions have really played to our advantage at London Met. Firstly, as an institution, we've always had a very clear social mission, and the majority of staff actually align their practice with that. Secondly, of course, we've been greatly assisted by the pioneering work of other universities such as Kingston and De Montfort, who have for several years now successfully demonstrated the impact of inclusive practice. But I think what's really helped at London Met in terms of us being able to quicken the pace of change, there's an absolute commitment to be radical and really change our graduate attributes around inclusive leadership. So I'll just quickly round off by giving you some of the highlights of our Education for Social Justice framework. We've committed, much to Trump's disappointment, to embedding critical race theory in all of our degree programmes. We're also ensuring that our students emerge as ambassadors and change makers around EDI, regardless of which career pathway they go into. All of them are going to have inclusivity training. All of them are going to be exposed to learning about the specific inequalities facing London as a city and as communities. We're very much looking forward to seeing the impact of the pilot. Next year it's going to be rolled out across the institution, and we hope that through doing so we're going to renew our own institutional identity. Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Kevin.
Thank you, Zainab. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to introduce myself. I'm the co-chair of the Higher Education Race Action Group, and I wanted to take a slightly different perspective, which is to take a step back from the initiatives that colleagues will speak about and think about the sector-wide learning that we can make and sector-wide initiatives that can support the progression of race equality. So the Higher Education Race Action Group, HEIs, is a network for colleagues interested in progressing race equality within the sector. We have over 400 members, and we do a range of different things, from sharing information on emails, running workshops, lobbying, promoting good practice, but most importantly, enabling colleagues to understand that race equality isn't an issue that affects them alone. Because very often when we come to talk about race equality, it can often feel like we're doing this by ourselves, or to those who are already converted or understand the agenda. I don't know if any other one can empathize with that, but you often feel like you're, is it just me? Am I the only person that sees this? Well, HEIs provides a forum for us to exchange ideas, views, and thoughts, but also to recognize that this is a problem that is sector-wide, and it isn't just the few of us who are in the sector. And I say the few of us because the data is something which I think is really important. Zainab talked about data, and I think one of the most important things that we have is data. I say this because when I work with colleagues in other European countries, I recognize how fortunate we are to have HESA, the Higher Education Statistical Agency, and Advanced HE, drawing on the expertise of the former Quality Challenge Unit. Because it is through that data that we understand the representation gap that we have in the sector. And I'm going to talk about the representation gap firstly as an issue. If you look at the data, around a quarter, in fact, over a quarter of first-year undergraduates are from Black and Asian backgrounds. But over 90%, around 92% of professors are white. There are about 25, possibly 27, but we don't know, it changes, but there are about 25 to 27 Black female professors in the entire United Kingdom. That's shocking for me. So when we think about representation gap, we have to think about the data. And I always say to colleagues, start with the data. Because when colleagues say to you, why are you focusing on this issue? I then have to go back and say to them, look at the data. Look at the dissonance between one set of data, which talks about undergraduate representation, and look at our senior representation. And then when we talk about attainment gaps, belonging, inclusive curriculum, it's systemic problems that actually a lack of seniority actually means we face. This isn't a problem unique to higher education. So when colleagues say to me, higher education is good, bad, or otherwise, this is a national problem, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. Green Park produced a report a couple of months ago that looked into the representation of leadership roles across the UK. And of the 1,099 positions they looked at, only 52 were held by people who were identified as, non-white. Of that 52, only 3 were Black women. So when we're thinking about the scale of the issue, this is not just a higher education issue. This is our society. We're not making the progress on race. And the data tells us the story. It's stagnating at one end of the spectrum, and it seems to be getting worse. So the question is, how and what can we do to take a systemic approach to changing this? So I would say, in my main job, I'm the Athena Swan manager at UCL. So people say, oh, gender, it's all about gender. And actually, people complain very often that gender is getting a priority over race. Actually, what I'd say is that the link to funding, which apparently is going to end, the link to funding from NIHR, which helped trigger engagement around gender equality, has helped to improve the practice systemically across the sector, whether that be in recruitment of students or staff, support and retention, progression, understanding awarding gaps, providing appraisals and supervisions. So the issue is not distinct to race, but this is a systemic issue about actually who held power in higher education, and it was mainly white middle-class men. So the idea is we need to use benchmarks and systems to help us understand the problem. And we have a tool to do that in the Race Equality Charter. The Race Equality Charter provides universities a framework around which you can look at race inequalities. And it does so by looking similarly to other charters like the Athena Swan Charter at the life cycles of staff and students. Now, the charter was set up in 2015. There are currently 66 members and 15 institutions that hold awards. That's 15 out of nearly 200 universities after 5 years. So for me, the biggest problem is that we don't actually understand the scale of the problem, because I don't know how many universities actually have taken the trouble to look at the scale of their issues systematically. And the reason why I say this is that we need to identify where we prioritize our resources. At the start of this session, we were talking about the scarcity of resources and the number of different competing interests we have. Well, by taking on board the Race Equality Charter, it actually allows universities to make the initial investment to understand where are our main problems. And it does this by basically looking at how are students engaged in higher education, who is engaged, what does that process look like? And it actually tells for many institutions that there is a real systemic problem, whether that be in who we're attracting, whether they get through the initial selections, whether they're retained. We know that there's an awarding gap, commonly known as an attainment gap, for students from different backgrounds. But it then talks about the progression onto postgraduate taught and PhDs. And when we think about widening participation, it isn't just about getting undergraduate students. There's a myth in higher education, which I think really needs to be challenged. We really must look at how students from Black and Asian backgrounds progress onto PGT and PGR, because if we're going to change the professoriate, we need to ensure that we have the diversity in the pipeline and secure that pipeline throughout the educational journey and into the professional life. And I think that needs to be a priority. So widening participation should not be driven by the fees arrangement or the agreements that we have with the Office for Students, but by the need to actually ensure that that 26% and that 90% white professoriate is more diverse over time. And that means that you have to secure the pipeline. The Race Equality Charter actually allows you to do that because it looks at this systematically. It then looks at the staff journey. And the staff journey is equally painful. So when we think about whether or not Black and Asian staff are much more likely to be on fixed term contracts, whether or not they get promotions, how that promotion looks like, whether or not they tend to be on the academic, harder contract, or whether on the softer teaching only or research only contracts. So there's a real need for us to understand the scale and the magnitude of our issues. And the Race Equality Charter provides that framework, but then most importantly, it places the onus on the university to actually identify what it wants to do. So what does it involve is a lot of data. For those of us who are clear about what the Athena Swan process looks like, it's a self-assessment process. But the most important thing is around how it engages staff, students, and the institution in recognizing the problems. So, and here, and my role as co-chair, I'm very keen to make sure that all organizations actually think about how do we take a systematic approach to race equality. Before we delve in and dive into trophies, which are nice to have and very important because we need to have an understanding of how we support initial issues and really key issues, we need to take a step back and make sure that we have the full picture so we can identify our priorities. Because without that, when we have a scarcity of resources, we may miss the biggest problems. So I'm going to leave that with you, and we can take up some of this in the questions and answers.
Thank you. Before we hand to Sarah, can I just encourage the participants again to put some questions in the Q&A. We have a few, but we could really do with a few more, because I think there's some fantastic points that are being raised, and it'd be great to hear some questions from the audience as well. Thank you. We've got 2 more brilliant speakers ahead, so if I could just hand to Sarah next. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the 4 speakers who've come before me for outlining some really helpful context to work towards racial inclusion within higher education. My role at Nottingham is as Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion and People. This was a new role that was established in September 2018. And I think, first of all, it's important to say that the reason that such a senior role at such a traditional Russell Group university was established was because our Vice-Chancellor recognised we were not doing well enough in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion. The work that I led was to develop a strategic delivery plan, and that within it had a strong commitment to inclusion and a focus on Black and minority ethnic as a characteristic that was particularly underserved by our current approach. The focus we've been doing since then has been delivery of priority areas through the Race Equality Charter, which I co-chair along with my colleague Stacey Johnson, who has been absolutely instrumental in leading BME inclusion within the healthcare sector, and actually received an MBE for her work a couple of years ago. And that's really, I think, helped us progress from a university that talked about equality, diversity and inclusion, signalled its commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion, to having a much more firm, proactive, anti-racist stance. But there's still much more work to do. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about my perspective as a senior leader in the context like the University of Nottingham, and how I've navigated through various different situations around racial inclusion that I think it's important to sort of share, and I really welcome people's views. And I wanted to reflect on 3 principles that I've realised are really important to bring to leadership of inclusion within a higher education institution: honesty, engagement, and empowerment. Honesty comes from recognising we're not currently doing well enough. In universities, we're used to telling everyone how brilliant we are. We're encouraged to do that. The systems enable us to do that. And so it feels uncomfortable to say, no, actually, this isn't good enough. And that's a big change that I think we've made within the sector, and we've certainly made within Nottingham. Our data, as others have represented, shows a significant underrepresentation of Black and minority ethnic staff, and particularly Black staff, particularly in senior roles where the influence on decision making comes through. We also have a significant degree awarding gap, again, particularly amongst our Black students. It's very different in different parts of the university, but it needs urgent action. The actions we've been taking so far through decolonising the curriculum, reverse mentoring, some fantastic videos that our Students' Union have put together, really representing the experience of Black and minority ethnic students, and our work looking at our historical links to slavery are great, but they're not giving us the progress that we need. So first of all, we need to focus on engagement. My engagements come through 2 different routes. Firstly, direct work with colleagues from the BME staff network and our BME student network. And I'm so grateful for the honesty, the challenge, the compassion, the anger that's come through those groups that has absolutely held me to account in a way that's entirely appropriate. I came from a background that was very well versed in gender equality within engineering, my own discipline. I also, from a professional point of view, had a strong interest in disability inclusion. But before I was in this role, I did not understand well enough the experience of our Black and minority ethnic staff and student groups. And I've managed to, I think, build my understanding through that direct engagement. But that engagement requires a balance. And it's really, really interesting to see how that plays out, because I've become really close to my colleagues who I work with there, yet I still need them, and they want themselves to take the advocacy role, a bit like you were talking about, Hilary, that call to action, that demand that needs to be placed. And so we need to continually expand those networks, maintain the challenge, but also make sure that this isn't just an advisory group that then lets me take over and take all the glory for the work that we've done. We need to maintain ownership of initiatives and give credit for initiatives to those groups as well. And I think that's something that's really interesting to navigate through. Another way that I've personally chosen to deliver the leadership in this role is through personal engagement. It's quite an exposed role, being a Pro-Vice-Chancellor in this type of context. And I have on many occasions stood in front of large groups of people and talked about our commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion. And that's really, really important, to look people in the eye and be clear about the change that we need to effect within the organisation. But I wanted to share a short example from an event that I was at a year or so ago now, as part of one of our No Place for Hate campaigns. This was a campaign that actually was in conjunction with one of the staff unions, Unison, and we've extended since to build in staff and student activities. I did one of my talks about equality, diversity and inclusion as part of a fantastic panel that talked about some of the reality, the very painful reality of hate crime and inclusion. And then someone stood up in the audience. It was a woman who was wearing a niqab, and she said, "This is lovely, this is fantastic to hear this commitment, but I've experienced hate crime on your campus." And it was a really interesting, very painful, very powerful experience. What we did in response to that, I think, is the thing that we really need to reflect on. So what we did was obviously spoke to the individual, and I don't want to talk about the details of the incidents because they're personal to her, but we were compelled to act. And we were compelled to act and understand why actually most of our systems has worked as they were intended to work in terms of responding to individual incidents, but we hadn't picked up a reluctance to classify an incident as being racially motivated. We hadn't picked up the systemic pattern of experiences that had happened to this individual. And we hadn't responded to the lack of trust in our reporting systems that was emerging through the community. So we made sure that we acted upon and fed back to the individual how we were acting upon those issues. The final thing I just want to note is empowerment. I've been really, really clear that my job is not to do EDI for other people, but to support and place demands on others to deliver EDI in all parts of our very large, very distributed organisation. And this came to the fore in the response to the Black Lives Matter protests from earlier this year. I wrote to all senior leaders and made it very, very clear that they were expected to respond. I would support them, our teams would support them, but it was their responsibility to respond. As a result of that, we've been in a series of meetings where I've not sat and listened to students alone, but I've brought in my senior colleagues to make sure they hear the stories that our students and our staff are sharing. And I've seen the power of that approach, actually. And it shocked me how used I have become to hearing some of these difficult stories. And I see the shock, sadly, on my colleagues' faces. So the last thing I want to talk about in empowerment is empowerment myself as a senior leader. I realised I wasn't doing well enough. I'd previously not challenged strongly enough when people had said, "Oh, that wasn't a racist incident, that's just what happens." And I now feel a personal responsibility, but because so many of my colleagues have trusted me, have trusted our university in sharing their experiences, the responsibility on us, as Hilary really eloquently outlined, is to act on that. It would be so disingenuous if we didn't use this activity to make sure we learn it's not enough just to not be racist. Our responsibility is work proactively to be anti-racist, and we need to make sure we're delivering action that is seen and felt by staff and students impacted by the systemic racism that's present within our institution and within the sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. So finally, but absolutely no means last in terms of the very critical words, Udi. If we could turn to Udi now for the last presentation, and just to encourage you again to put some questions in those Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, as I've already said. I'm just going to talk you through some of the work that we're doing at the University of Bradford towards inclusive race equality as a big part of the work that we do. So some of you will be aware that we hold the social inclusion University of Social Inclusion of the Year 2020. And I have personally been reflecting on these and asking many questions, and I will return to it because it has formed the fabric of the work that we're doing on as being anti-racist. So I think the first context for us is we've been doing this, and there is this expectation that because 75% of our students or more are from a BME, a Black minority ethnic background, then that's it, we're done, we're sorted. And I have to go into places to say, I'm sorry, it doesn't work like that, because it could even be a real challenge that if we are a white academic space that we are, we might misunderstand what's happening to our BME students. So COVID came and showed the world that we are not as tidy as we often think we are. So COVID-19 has been, for me, an amplifier. And I think for HE, it's a big call for us to rethink and really look at what we're doing. So for Bradford, we've been self-searching, we've been looking at the things that we're doing. And then Judge Floyd was killed in our very, very eyes, murdered. And we all saw that. And then it became a real problem. People trying to be doing serious things like Black Lives Matter only started then. And our university did it. But when you looked at the response that we all received, was we put out these statements and the world said, thanks for your message of support. Now, please send me an image of your executive team. We received that as well, as many other people received it. And then we received more about, yes, you've given us a statement, but can you tell us exactly what we are going to do to turn these words into actions and stop lying to us, literally? So for the University of Bradford, we are taking a whole institution approach, which is structural and intersectional. And there is the other bit that I've linked into this, and I've been saying to our senior team, we have to utilize and adopt the state of emergency approach. And I have no apologies at all. I'm not apologetic, and I'm saying to them, if we could pull everything that we have pulled to respond to this pandemic, racism is a pandemic, and we have to pull everything to make sure that things work. So you can imagine the kinds of conversations that we're having in that boardroom, and Bradford University insisting on being an anti-racist and taking an anti-racist stance. So one of the things that we've done is we've launched a decolonization project, and it's about decolonizing the university, working alongside our students' union, insisting on eradication rather than continuing to faff around how we work with our access and participation. It's about eradication. And these are very, very positive words that we're using. So we launched our anti-racist university decolonization work on the 21st of July. And what we did was actually get everybody online and talk through exactly what this will mean for Bradford University, insisting on our anti-racist stance. And I made this bold statement because sometimes we all hide behind our diversity. And our bold statement is that being a diverse university is not enough, that being the University of the Year for Social Inclusion is not enough. It has to be matched with real actions. That diversity as part of the university's heritage and the celebration that we do all the time is not enough. that being non-racist is not enough. And finally, I have made it clear that the only option we have is being an anti-racist university. The other thing is demanding accountability. And I go into the boardroom that I sit and I'm saying to my colleagues, we have to show strong leadership in tackling racism, and that we need to align this with all the work that we're doing on Athena, Swan, with all the work that we're doing in other areas around employability. So it's a whole systems approach. And in that whole systems approach, there is something about acknowledging that there is a problem and therefore creating solutions together to get to our endpoint. It's about providing safe spaces for people to have that conversations and insisting that the conversations will not be comfortable. The strong leadership component has got a bit about how do we equip leaders to start from saying, yes, there is a problem. Yes, I can be personally racist, and how I need to self-reflect, work with people to get to where we need to. And that links us to embracing that organizational diagnosis and ensuring that we get evidence, fair enough, but we're not using not having the evidence as an excuse for not starting this. Because I keep saying to my colleagues, I think we have a lot of data. We have enough data to do the work that we need to do. And I hate turning up at meetings where people are saying we haven't got the data and therefore we collect more. So I go in and say, I'm sorry, you have enough, start work. And then you collect as you go, on with it, insisting that we embed evaluation in everything we do. And that evaluation being developmental so that we can learn as we're going on. So I'm then going to look at how one example of a project that we're doing at the moment. So I've set up a project called EB, Executive Board Connect. And there are two strands to the EB Connect. One is the learning partnership. So in Bradford, we've been using learning partnership approach since 2004. And I actually developed the learning partnership approach to get senior team members paired up with BME academics and professional service staff. And then we have used the principle since 2004 in many areas of our work around gender equality, around TEL, which is technology enhanced learning. So these principles are being used, but what we're doing it now is really reclaiming it for our race equality work. So the EB Connect is firstly pairing up senior management team members with Black students. And I am having to, and I did this session yesterday, reminding my senior colleagues that is about the lived experience of Black students in white spaces. And I spend time just talking through with my colleagues about the myth that because we have the numbers, we are sorted. Just to remind them that issues of numbers do not come in when we're talking about race equality. We're actually talking about power. And I'm in this process, and the briefing I had yesterday, I'm saying to my colleagues, you've got to have the cultural humility to accept that you haven't got solutions on everything, and that your Black students will help you in sharing their lived experiences and you working with them to co-create solutions. And that's the emphasis. So the learning partnership with EB members, exec board members, is the beginning of other learning partnerships. So we're moving on from EB members to learning partnership, this time between BME students and other leaders in the organizations, including our council members. Then we move on to BME staff working with EB members, and this will carry on, including the fact that we're actually using learning partnership approach to deliver our access and participation plan. So all these will be evaluated as we do them, And we're hoping that by the year 2025, and this is what colleagues have told us, that there are specific indicators of success that we will test out on a yearly basis. So thank you so much. I want to pass you back to Zoe.
Thank you, Udi. Some brilliant ideas there. But I would honestly say brilliant ideas from all the panelists you've heard from. We have got about 8 or 9 questions in the Q&A. We've got about 20-25 minutes after the break for questions, and I would encourage you to look at those questions, to vote on them, and also to think about some of your own. There's some great questions there about, okay, how do you implement this? So what's the reality been of trying to implement some of these ideas and concepts, and how it sort of transposes in the organisation? So if you've got any other questions, please do pop them in that Q&A. I really do hope that you will come back and bear with us after the break. So you've got about 10 minutes to grab that cup of tea and have that comfort break, and we'll see you back in about 10 minutes time. Thank you very much indeed. Welcome back, everybody, after the comfort break, and thank you ever so much indeed for continuing to join us in the second half of this webinar today around tackling racism and racial inequalities in higher education, and most importantly about taking action to do so. So that's really important. So we've now had a number of questions that have come in, which is absolutely fantastic, and I'm going to try and ensure that I might well group some questions together to make sure all panelists have opportunity to respond. So the most popular question is for Zainab to talk about the backlash that she mentioned in terms of the work that she's done, particularly around BAME initiative. So Zainab, do you want to just respond to that question? Hopefully you can read it there.
Yeah, thanks Zoe, and thanks for the question. And actually Zoe, you referred to this in your opening remarks about the real discomfort sometimes that we see in relation to the role and place of positive action. And colleagues should feel reassured that actually if you look at the letter of the law around the public sector equality duty, it's very clear that institutions are mandated to target resource towards closing some of the disparities we see. That's the first thing. So legally we're covered. I think also in terms of the specific backlash, I would phrase it more as institutional surveillance and also othering, which if there are any colleagues who are part of the participants who are from minority backgrounds, perhaps you might resonate with that feeling. It's well documented in the scholarship as well in terms of the way in which Black expertise, minority expertise is sometimes treated or excluded from the decision-making frame. So I think in terms of how I responded to that, I wasn't alone. I worked with an absolutely brilliant team. That steering group that I mentioned of Black and minority staff and students, you know, we were a real collective, and that certainly helps. And I know that's not always the case, where we do unfortunately see a trend where particularly you'll have a lone individual member of staff who is leading the mantle for race work. That is not the best condition for anyone to be in, and it can be a very lonely place. The second thing that helped us through that period was the role of white allies. And Sarah spoke beautifully earlier about the way in which white allies need to leverage their leadership. And actually I experienced that firsthand with colleagues having the conversation when I wasn't even in the room. So advocating for the role of equity and really promoting it as one of the jewels in the university's crown. I think what helped as the programme developed was the need to take time to actually explain the rationale and context. And I thought it was really interesting that both Kevin and Udi referred to the role of data. We need the data, but we don't want to be sucked into this quagmire of endless requests for further analysis and preventing that real change. But that being said, people deserve the opportunity to undertake their own learning. We've all got lots of unlearning to do here. And so then taking time to meet with different groups of staff, both staff who were in student-facing roles, so they could properly communicate the messaging around the programme, and also staff who were behind the scenes who perhaps didn't really understand why it is that we need to create closed sessions, particularly for Black students, where it can be quite you're increasing their level of vulnerability when you invite them to speak about their own personal experiences of racism, why that might be appropriate. So having the conversation and coupling the action with a space where staff could actually come together and discuss why a certain decision was being taken, I think that was really key. Would I do it again? Yes, absolutely. I'm already doing that type of work at London Met. I've got fantastic teams who are creating new forms of well-being support. We've got targeted counselling. Hilary talked about care right at the start. Yes, you know, we need to lead with intent. So we can't just have blanket services and expect that the needs of particular groups are going to be addressed by that, when all the evidence tells us that their particular experiences and needs are distinct. So I'm all for positive action.
Thank you very much, Zainab. Just to say, we've got about another 15 minutes or so for questions. I'm going to come on to a set of questions to Hilary about students, just so attending participants are aware of what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk to Sarah about recruitment and leadership. I'm going to ask Kevin to comment on reporting tools and the links to data, obviously, and the whole systems approach. And I'm going to ask Udi to comment about evaluation, because that's something that I think I found quite powerful in her presentation, has been asked about. But one question, and Zainab just mentioned it, is about allyship. And I just think particularly about being a white ally, and I just want to make it clear that I see ally as a verb. It's as a verb. And in terms of particularly what white colleagues can do, it's about understanding and listening. It's about fundamentally educating yourself, not asking others to educate you, but you educating yourself. It's about listening, it's about understanding, and it's about using your privilege alongside, not on behalf of, but alongside others in terms of what the allyship means. It's not speaking over, and it's not speaking on behalf of others. But most importantly, it's about recognising when you make mistakes. And as Sarah alluded to, in my role as sort of PVC EDI, I've made lots and lots of mistakes over the last 6 to 8 months, and I will continue to do so. But it's about recognising that, apologising for that, but also in terms of continuing to educate myself. In terms of what practically you can do, call out microaggressions, call those out on a daily basis in terms of what you see and what you hear. But it is a verb. Being an ally is a verb, and I just want to make that really clear. But it's educating yourself. So that's some of the practical things and the perspective that I personally take about allyship. So I'm going to move on to Hilary. There was a couple of questions in the Q&A particularly around, you mentioned yourself about, and other panelists mentioned about the prospects of BAME students, employability. So I wonder if you could pick up on some of those questions, please, Hilary.
Sure. I'm just looking through, and I think there's a few different types of questions that I've seen regarding that. Firstly, as a general point, I think it's important that when we're thinking about certain things that particularly affect Black and BAME students, I think it's important to know that those issues don't just come out of nowhere. I think it's important for us to understand that, I think Kevin mentioned it, that, you know, a lot of these issues that we see and a lot of the results of racism that we see, especially ending up in higher education, don't actually start in higher education, but have been perpetrated throughout a student's educational experience and have ultimately come to a head at higher education, where they're now in a space where they're feeling that impact a lot more tangibly. And I think it's important that when we think about tackling racism, we do it in a way where we actually understand that with racism being systemic, it means that we need to look at it as a whole system. And so if anybody is here sort of thinking about what their own individual responsibility is, I think it's important to understand that as much as you have individual responsibility, you too have collective responsibility. And so in the same ways that we are pushing for our higher education institutions to be really proactive with anti-racist work, I think it's important that higher education institutions are also taking further education, secondary education and primary education institutions on that journey too. And where they might not have the resource or the autonomy to do so, I think it's important higher education really assist them and partner with them in making sure that on a through basis, Black students, BAME students are able to have that full educational experience that is tackling racism right from the roots and throughout their university experience. So that's what I can speak to regarding the employability questions and specific the specific impacts of racism on Black and BAME students. I also think I saw a question about talking about Black students not engaging with some of the initiatives that are put out by universities, and how could we work with that. And I think whilst it might be frustrating that like Black and BAME students might not be engaging with initiatives that have been made to support them, I think it's really important to understand where the roots of why they're not participating comes from. And I think it's important, as I said earlier, and I think it's been alluded to throughout everybody's talks, is that trust is really, really important. And if students aren't interacting and engaging, then there probably is an issue of trust in feeling like the work that is being done is authentic and the approach has integrity in it, in actually helping those students, rather than meeting awards or trying to I don't know, tick off a metric. But students really want to see a meaningful intention before they can really engage.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Just to explain to attendees, I know there's sets of questions in the Q&A, but because of time and ensuring there's equity of voices in response from the panelists, that's why I've grouped together questions around particular themes. So rather than read out individual questions, I've grouped them around particular themes. So hopefully your questions are being answered, but in a thematic way by the appropriate panel member. So I now would like to pass to Kevin, because there's some questions, particularly around anonymous reporting, and whole systems, and most importantly about the link between this and other challenges such as COVID that we've heard, the questions have been asked about. So Kevin, if you could pick up on those, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I always start with data. I think data is a helpful metric and a starting point. One, because it allows us to understand the scale of a problem and then make a decision about what's a proportionate response. Racial harassment in higher education is endemic. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission produced a report last October which highlighted the scale of the issue. Half of students and staff experience some form of racial harassment. 3 in 20 staff leave their employer because of racial harassment. 1 in 20 students do so. So the need for us to do something is there, at least from the reporting of Black and Asian staff and students. The challenge is that there's a lack of confidence in reporting tools. And that came out from the Equality and Human Rights Commission report, where many universities that were asked reported maybe 1 or 2 cases, if that, in terms of racial harassment. And when challenged on it, there is a real issue here about actually what are organizations doing and what are universities specifically doing to have systems in place that actually, one, have the confidence of BAME staff. The Black and Asian staff need to have confidence that there's something going to happen. But 2, there's some real issues, and this goes across the piece about bullying and harassment reporting, about actually how do people who report get feedback on the outcomes. Because this seems to be a consistent message that comes out from communities, is that whether this be around sexual misconduct, other forms of homophobic or racist harassment, is that people aren't actually hearing what the outcomes are. So there's a lack of confidence that the system works. So there's something that's really important here about actually what can universities do. So I've worked with different universities over the last 12 years. I'm at UCL at the moment. We launched a system called Report and Support, which uses an online reporting tool that other universities have engaged with. It comes through an organization called Culture Shift, and it provides an online tool which can be anonymous or may not be anonymous, depending on the wishes of the individuals. And the idea is to try and think about actually what different channels can universities employ to help increase confidence in the systems. So that might be the use of online reporting, it could be dignity at work or study advisors, it could be having HR professionals who go out and actually outreach in this space, but there isn't a simple way to actually address a culture issue because people don't feel like the system is listening. And in terms of what we need to do to address this, well, the scale of the problem is clear. I just don't understand how we can ignore it now because the data is there saying that this is an issue. Now, looking at COVID-19, COVID-19 affects everybody at the moment, and we know it affects everybody, but there are different communities that are particularly affected by it. And we know that Black and Asian communities are much more vulnerable. The data is suggesting this. So then the responses that we have to adjust to this. Now, there are so many issues that universities are saying that they're experiencing at the moment. So last week, the government said that they're going to reduce the burden on universities by removing the requirement to do Athena Swan. I'm not sure that helps us, because actually what we need to do is actually, what I would say is have an incentive to understand our problems and then make a decision about what we're going to do about them. But if you take away the tools or the incentive to actually engage in understanding the problem, then we may then find that we have blind spots as organizations. So I would encourage universities and colleagues across the sector to say, whilst the government says there's no stick anymore around doing things like Athena Swan, what we need to have is a culture which says we need to understand the problem. And if we don't understand the problem, we are then putting ourselves at an organizational disadvantage because we will not be able to serve our communities. I'm going to hand over to let other colleagues contribute because I think it's important because we have a short amount of time.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Kevin. And I think you're reflecting some of the concerns across the community, particularly colleagues like all the panelists and others, about is this a good thing or a bad thing with the removal of things such as the charter awards? You know, for many of us, it's not about the rewards, it's about the strategy and the culture. And I know that Sarah and I have spoken about this with UDI, but also it's about making sure where institutions are on that journey, and therefore, you know, is it a stick that can allow some of this change to happen, which I think leads us nicely into a set of questions and comments I would like UDI to consider, which is, you know, one of the questions is, what does an anti-racist university look like? So how do we evaluate that we've got an anti-racist university? But also other questions have been, you know, we're at the very early stages in a small institution around this work. So what advice would you give us? And I think it's recognising that different institutions are at different parts of the journey. And so, UDI, what advice would you give to both those at the start, those that are during, and more importantly, how we evaluate and know that we've got an anti-racist university?
Thank you very much for that, and fantastic questions. I think I want to wrap it into something that looks like this. The first thing about an anti-racist university is we have to be at a space where we actually acknowledge that there is a problem. Denial will not take us to where we need to go to. So that's the beginning of the journey. Being defensive is not going to take us there. Worrying about discomfort, I have had to say to colleagues, I'm sorry, this is not going to be comfortable, you know, because I hear a lot about that. So the starting point is accepting that there is that problem. And then you move on to a place where you are allowing and supporting people to self-reflect. So in my university, we are now at a point of self-reflection in homogeneous groups. So I'm asking Black staff, I'm asking them to also reflect on where we have been and where we're going. Asking white staff to reflect as well, and then we will move into heterogeneous conversations about where we've been and where we're going. So at the event on the 21st of July, we had a very interactive session where we were posing things to colleagues. One was, what do you think will stop us from getting there? And using our new strategy year 2025 as the basis for checking that. So what are the hindrances? What do you perceive as barriers and challenges? We also asked people to look at what enablers do we have? And the last question was, tell us, what would 2025 look like as an anti-racist university? And I guess the beauty with that was that we were actually getting people to work with us and define things with us. We had a lot of examples of what the issues are at present. HR came up several times. So when it came to, for example, what would 2025 look like, people were saying engagement of HR policies, ensuring that the defensiveness in the system is completely worked on. The other thing that colleagues were saying was when people can actually talk about this, have the opportunity. Yesterday we heard at the conference Zainab and I attended about breaking the silence, being in a space where people can start up this discussion without looking on the shoulders, who's looking at me, who's gonna do what. The other thing is real, tangible examples of achievement. And I use the word eradication with no apologies. People were saying we would have gotten there if we eradicated some of the things that we've always known about the differential outcomes for Black students and Black staff. And they started telling us some specifics. The other thing is we were very, very reassured. We reassured ourselves that the 2025 is a good place to aim at, but what are the early wins? What are we going to see when our students come back on campus towards the end of this month, early next month? And what are we going to see early next year? What will be our midterm goals and what would be? But the basis of that embedded evaluation is ensuring that we are actually setting the indicators ourselves. It's not going to be imposed on us. So what we're doing now is creating spaces to start talking about what would it look like? What would it look like by December? What would it look like in a year's time? What would the learning partnership result in? And how do you take steps to get to that place? So I guess the other thing is how would we work with the city to produce that anti-racist university, because our students interact a lot with the city. So we're already seeing activities like the council had to set up an equalities group, which I chair. And within that, we're already talking about monuments of colonialism in Bradford, what we do with it, and also looking at who's missing when you analyze the statues in the cities. So we've identified a lot of things, but we're very clear that it's going to be co-created with all stakeholders.
Thank you very much indeed. Udi, thank you. Now, Sarah, there's some questions regarding recruitment, particularly at senior leader level. We've heard a lot from the panelists about representation or the lack of representation at senior level within institutions. So if you could pick up on the answer to those questions, that would be fantastic. And then just to say to all panelists, if you want to add any final words in the few minutes that we have after Sarah's spoken, or a couple of minutes, then please just let me know. And I hope that all of the participants will remain with us for a final session about inclusive mindset as well. So Sarah, your answer to the questions around representation and
Thanks. So some really, really good questions about representation, because, and I thought it was really interesting, the sentiment in one of the questions, which was, you know, basically institutions say nice words about inclusion, but then when it comes to the actual process, surprise, surprise, it's probably a white man that's appointed. So I'll talk maybe about three different elements very, very quickly. The first is we've piloted something quite extensively now at Nottingham, through some work in our ambition to diversify recruitment. And we've worked with a partner, Diversity by Design, to sort of develop this. And it's a really holistic approach of looking at recruitment, particularly at senior level. So it looks at our criteria, and it looks at the way that, so we don't have CVs for some jobs, even academic roles, and we ask people to respond to questions. And those questions ask much more about potential than about experience, which is really important. The second is, as far as possible, we make the process anonymous. I used this for a series of roles I was recruiting to myself, and it was really, really interesting. So the first shortlisting process is extremely anonymous, and then gradually, as you move through the process, there are, and obviously at the interview, there ends up being a face-to-face setting, but that was incredibly powerful in making sure that we had a diverse shortlist. also targeted recruitment to specifically take positive action and focus on underrepresented groups disproportionately when we're advertising roles. Because again, surprise, surprise, the white men, and in many cases the white women as well, find the roles automatically through the social capital that they have within the different context. Thinking about the panel membership, making sure it doesn't need to just be senior people on the panel, and very often having a voice from the student perspective, from the junior staff perspective, from the different job role perspective, can really, really make sure that we have a more holistic view when we're selecting our candidates. And then also using the law to help us. So we're allowed to use EDI considerations as a tie break, but if you're scoring a load of candidates out of 30, then it's very, very unlikely, because you've probably got some inherent bias within your scoring system, that you're agonizing between the difference of a score of 27 and 26. If you just say, no, I'm putting candidates into low, medium and high categories, then you can look at all of those who are in the high category and use EDI as a tie break. But more widely, we need to challenge our assumptions as to what good candidates look like for these roles. If, as Kevin said, we have only between 25 to 30 black women in professorial roles in the UK, and we require someone to be a professor before they're able to be a Pro-Vice Chancellor, then surprise, surprise, we don't get many black women in those roles because the pool is so small. So let's challenge our assumptions about what makes a good leader, what makes a good senior role in those contexts. And then the final thing, and this is something we can all do, something that I love this notion, when we write job applications, we talk about specific things that show our experience or show our potential. And we can think about these as the golden tickets. Many of those golden tickets that help us get jobs come through social capital, come through biased processes, come through having worked full-time rather than part-time, come through having had a little tap on the shoulder and said, oh, by the way, do you want to sit on that committee? Do you want to do that external examiner role? Do you want to present in this prestigious panel? And lo and behold, those who have more social capital, who are less victims of bias within our system, end up looking better on apparently our meritocratic recruitment processes. So think about all of our responsibility when we're giving out those golden tickets. And then we can gradually but effectively start to make change within the representation at senior leadership levels.
Thank you, Sarah. Some really practical advice there in terms of what we can all do. I'm going to give the final word to Hilary on behalf of the students, given that they are the lifeblood of what we are and what we're about. So I'm going to give the final words to Hilary before we close this panel. But as I say, do stay with us, stay with the webinar for the inclusive mindset. Hilary.
Thank you so much. And I'll be really quick because I know that Ellie has a fantastic session lined up for you all. I just wanted to say thank you so much for everybody coming here and being so eager to listen and learn. And I hope that you go away from this ready to act. And if you act today, props to you, but you've got tomorrow, you've got next week. And I think it's important that, you know, as soon as you can seize the opportunity and make sure that you do act. I've been really reflecting as I've been hearing my fellow amazing panelists talk, and I think what's been really, really resounding to me is understanding that everybody has a place in this work. Everybody has a place in this space to do this work, whether you are a white ally, whether you are a person of color, whether you are black or BAME, you all are involved in this work. And I think it's really important, as I was listening, to think about how much, if we really want to think about the individual impact of it, I think everybody is affected by this work. And so by refusing to do this work, I think everybody is affected too. And what's really come onto my mind and into my heart is that, you know, liberation doesn't work if we don't try and liberate everybody. And so I think in the same way that we put effort into so many other types of liberation, which has been really, really positive, I think we need to understand how they're all interlinked. And unless we are proactive in liberation in every form and in every sense, and really understanding the intersectionality that comes with people affected by any type of injustice, discrimination, and you know, bias, I think it's important that we really take it forward in really thinking about the human element and that intersectional reality, but also the structural element, which will enable us to really tackle it at the root. And I know that students have been saying this and coming as themselves to institutions to make sure that human aspect is seen, and for institutions to really understand and feel those experiences. And I think, you know, just to round it off, I think it's important that we remember the title of the session, Change Starts Now. And you've all heard about the change, you've all hopefully felt the need for the change, and I hope going forward we start to see that change, and especially with Black History Month coming up, I can't emphasize it more, that the fruits of the labour of students, staff, activists can be seen, and by everybody expecting to see a return on those commitments that have already been made. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Hilary. And can we give a round of applause? Can all the panelists, because you have to applaud each other because we can't hear the applaud others too. Thank you very much indeed for all the panelists, and thank you indeed for all the participants. Do bear with us for another 15, 20 minutes, and I'm going to hand back to Jeannette. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Zoe. I'd now like to introduce Ellie Highwood, who is one of our Sons Associates and an expert in this field. And Ellie's going to take us through an inclusive mindset session.
Thanks, Jeannette. And what a fantastic panel. So what I'm about to do for the next 10 minutes or so is to build on what many of the panelists talked about diversity and inclusion being everybody's job. It's not the role of the D&I team to do all the diversity and inclusion, nor is it the role of the diversity and inclusion champions, nor is it the role of the people of colour within your organisation. We have to start with ourselves, and a lot of things we've heard about today have been really good, tangible actions to think about what you can do to actions within and across the workplace. But we have to recognise that there is a link between what we do as individuals and what we do as the organisation. So what I want to do today is, first of all, if you have pen and paper with you, I'd like you to make a note of 10 people you most trust in terms of decisions you need to make at work or in other parts of your life. So I'm going to write my 10 down because that gives me roughly the same time as other people might take. So the 10 people you most trust in terms of decisions. Okay, so whether you've got 5 or whether you've got 10, what I'd now like you to do is to note their gender, their race or ethnicity, and their age, or at least a guess at these. It might not be quite right. And the point of this is thinking about how diverse in lived experiences or ways of thinking are your 10 most trusted. Are they all quite similar to you and all very overlapping? Or are they more diverse and spread out? So Matthew Syed, in his recent book about rebel ideas, calls one of these sort of groups of clones and the other one groups of rebels. I suspect he was Star Wars influenced. But this is one of the exercises that lots of people use to think about how diverse your network is, because that has a big influence on how we behave. One of the ways that we behave is that we can be unconscious, but we can get some unconscious biases. Now, we have to make lots and lots of decisions all the time, and it's useful to think about how these so-called unconscious biases exist. There are lots of different terms for unconscious bias. It can include implicit bias, limiting belief, but essentially these are things that influence our decisions when we don't really know they're influencing us. If you are consciously making a decision that is biased or racist, then that is a conscious bias or a prejudice. That is not an unconscious bias. And as soon as you become aware of something that you weren't previously aware of that influences your decisions, that also becomes a conscious bias. But if we had to make conscious decisions all the time, we would not be able to function. We get lots of information, we need to make rapid decisions. We can't go through a step-by-step decision-making process if we need to know that a red light at a traffic light means that cars need to stop. So our brain uses shortcuts. Pattern recognition builds on previous experiences, a bit like muscle memory when you're training your body. And then when it meets a set of similar circumstances, it uses those patterns to make the decision. And that can mean that the decisions we make are based on biased experiences. And so we can get an unconscious bias that we're not aware of, where we have this pattern recognition system that our brains need, comes into, crashes up against a stereotype or a limiting belief that we have formed through our exposure as we grow up, through our exposure to media, and that gives us an unconscious bias. And the reason unconscious bias, so some types of unconscious bias are here. These are ones that are particularly affect hiring situations, but things like the affinity bias, where we're hiring people the same as ourselves. And it's natural to have some form of affinity bias, and actually you probably have groups of people that you trust who look very much like you, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that you might be missing out on useful experiences from other people and other lived experiences. There are horns effects, where one bad thing on somebody's CV, and I note that Sarah's approach to or the diversity by design will get around some of this. One bad thing on a CV can cloud our judgment of a whole person's job application. And there are many other forms of unconscious bias. These are not all the ones that exist. There are many more. But it matters because bias is part of how inequalities establish and perpetuate. So this is one version of something called the oppression cycle, and it shows that stereotypes and unconscious bias, views that are phrased as "they are" about a group, you're immediately othering a group, can lead to prejudice, which means they can't. We're making assumptions about what a particular group can or can't do, which can then lead to discrimination. We won't, therefore, give them this opportunity. And that can lead to oppression or internalization. And that's the cycle of how inequalities establish and perpetuate through cycles of oppression. And some of the actions that you've heard about today fit into different parts of this cycle. So what I'm talking about now is bias awareness training, acknowledging privilege in the context of white privilege in particular, use of positive images, counterexamples, challenging stereotypes, challenging microaggressions. They all fit into the trying to break down these stereotypes and stop prejudices forming. Then you have, policies, procedures and guidelines have their place in making sure that prejudice doesn't become discrimination. Then sharing power between different groups, representation and consultation has its part later in the cycle, and monitoring and review, the ever important data, mentoring and sponsoring, and counterexamples and role models also have a view in breaking down these stereotypes at different stages. So what do we do about our unconscious biases? Unconscious bias develops over time, so solutions need to also be implemented over time. And this is behind some of the findings that a lot of unconscious bias training doesn't actually work, says the person presenting an unconscious bias training session. And they don't work because they're not presented in context. They work to raise awareness. That's the most they can do. You need to produce behaviour change. You need it to be an ongoing process. And there are two complementary and necessary types of intervention. One, to challenge and reduce biases, and two, to reduce the risk that biases influence decisions. And this is, as I said, is work that needs to be done by individuals and organisations. The inclusive mindset in an individual, i.e. trying to remove those stereotypes or give yourself counterexamples, and also to look at things through a diversity and inclusion lens. An inclusion lens feeds into the removal of systemic bias in organisations and vice versa. So I'm going to give you some asynchronous learning, which is what it's all about these days. Some homework exercises for you. Try them out, pass them around your team, see what they think. The next few days, see if you can catch yourself making assumptions about people or situations that you see. Then ask yourself honestly if that would have affected a decision you made. This might not feel very comfortable. I don't feel comfortable when I do this, but this isn't about you. It's not about me. It's not about your discomfort. It's not about my discomfort. It's about becoming better at doing this. And the other thing is to think about what influences how you form stereotypes, how you think. Who do you watch, listen to, or read? Who do you follow, like, retweet, or share? This week, follow someone new from a different social group, or try a different podcast or author. And if it feels forced and uncomfortable, this is a version of positive action, and that's okay. And it will get easier, but we also have to get used to being uncomfortable, as Udi said very eloquently earlier. So specifically for racism, you can also, we've been talking about becoming anti-racist universities. You can also become an anti-racist individual. And I like this graphic from Andrew Ibrahim, which maps the journey from becoming anti-racist through a fear zone where you deny racism is a problem and avoid hard questions. You want to be comfortable. Through learning, which is seeking out questions that make me uncomfortable, understanding your own privilege in ignoring racism, educating yourself. Not necessarily asking other people to do it, but educating yourself, identifying your own biases and knowledge gaps and being honest about those. To the growth zone where you're speaking out. This is where advocacy comes. This is sitting with being uncomfortable, speaking out when you see racism. And don't let mistakes deter me from being better. More steps you could take. This is just a taster session. This is just some practical ideas following on from everyone else's practical ideas. Practice talking about bias and privilege. It gets easier, and talking about it helps you understand. Listen to others around you who have very different experiences. Learn how to minimize the impact of biases on decisions. So risky situations include tiredness, stress, and weirdly, either how far or how close you are to a particular decision. Both can lead to bias. As you think about your workplace, look at what's happening around you through diversity lenses and practice noticing bias in behavior. Challenge bias. Lots of places run active bystander training, but there are other ways of doing this. Question policies or practices. Make yourself really unpopular with your HR advisors team. Learn about being an ally to underrepresented groups, and we've heard a lot about that from people today. Finally, I'd like to leave you with this thought. What will you do first? It doesn't have to be everything all at once. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it does need to be something. And one of my favorite quotes is, individually we are one drop, together we're an ocean. So now I'm going to hand you back to Jeannette just for a few final remarks.
Thank you, Ellie. I'd like to finish by thanking our panellists and Ellie for the inspirational ideas and insights on how we can make our universities racially inclusive for students and staff. And I have the powerful words of Hilary on behalf of the students resonating in my head. It's crucial to act now or never be trusted again. I feel inspired, and I hope you do too. Thank you as well for your searching questions and for joining us today. Finally, a really important date for your diaries, the SUMS annual conference, which is on the 27th of November, and it's all about opportunities to transform the sector. I look forward to seeing you there.